Good morning. There have been enormous advances in medicine over the past few decades, but there's a wonderful saying that you're climbing the ladder to success to find you're on the wrong wall. And I think in many ways we have been on the wrong wall, because really the best treatment of heart disease, the best treatment of cancer, the best treatment of all of our modern diseases is not to get them in the first place. It's called prevention. And really the best preventative strategy we have is happiness. And I believe that happiness, peace and contentment are easily the best drugs on the planet. And I want to give you my 5 keys to happiness. And if you think of it logically, everything's in 5s. You've got 5 digits, you've got 5 senses, there are 5 seasons if you count Frankie Valley. Everything's in 5s. So let's go through those. The first key is control. It's the control we have over our own lives. And I want to tell you a story about this man here, when he comes up. Viktor Frankl. Over 60 years ago, Viktor Frankl wrote this book, Man's Search for Meaning. And Vic was in a particularly good position to talk about stress and suffering because he was tortured in a Nazi concentration camp for a couple of years. And he got out of the camp and his mate said, Vic, you've got to be angry. You've got to want to get revenge on these people. Let me give you one very important point. You want revenge on anyone, dig 2 graves. So Vic said, look, it was the worst 2 years of my life. It was enormous suffering. They could make me suffer, they could torture me, but what they couldn't do was take away my right to choose how I wanted to react to them. I want to tell you about a very simple story from my own practice. A beautiful man called Ken. Ken had every reason to complain about his life. He'd had bypass surgery, which is a big deal, many people have that, but that was the least of Ken's problems. He had a thing called muscular dystrophy, which I'm sure you all know about, couldn't use his muscles properly. And again, that was probably the least of Ken's problems because he was clinically blind as well. And Ken used to catch a couple of buses and a train to come to my clinic, and he'd say, oh, Dr. Walker, it's such a privilege to be one of your patients. I said, no, Ken, it's such a privilege to be in the same room as you. This man used to get up every morning, lived in Leichhardt, caught a bus into the city and used to help the Catholic priests serve Mass. I said, Ken, what do you do this for? He said, oh, doctor, living is such a privilege. I feel I've got to contribute. And what Viktor Frankl said, what Ken says, it's not the suffering that's important, but the way you handle the suffering. So the first point is control. I want you to be an active participator on this world. Take control of the only thing you can take control of, you. It's no one else's responsibility to make you happy. It's your responsibility. That's number 1, control. Number 2 is commitment. I want you to have a commitment to living now. Be emotionally up to date. Do not practice woundology. What's woundology? Woundology is when you walk around with this wound on your sleeve from some trauma you've had many years ago for everyone to see. There is not one person in this room who hasn't been traumatized by something in their life. And I can tell you probably the greatest healing thing you can do, not for the person who is the perpetrator of your trauma, but for yourself, is to forgive and move on. Send love to that person. Send forgiveness. No matter what they've done, I promise you it's healing for you. For you. Have a commitment to living now. One important way to be able to do all of these things is to spend a half an hour every day in silence. For the last 20 years, I've been meditating every single day. I did it this morning and I will do it tomorrow morning. And I couldn't imagine a life without meditation. Many studies have shown 50 to 60% reduction in many different diseases by the regular practice of meditation, and that's the least important reason to meditate. It opens up your mind to different things, it makes you calmer, and it certainly helps you achieve happiness. The third point here is challenge. See every day that you live as a challenge. See every situation you're in as a test. Now, you may recognise one of these very handsome men on the stage, but on this slide, but the other fellow is my brother. My brother's a bit of an idiot, really. He only has a PhD in pure philosophy. He speaks 8 languages and his hobby is Middle Kingdom hieroglyphics. And until last July, he was the headmaster of the King's School in Rochester in Kent and had been there for 26 years. And what blew me away about this is I had the honour of being the final lecturer in his school's wait for this, 1400th year anniversary. And my brother, when I went to the school, he took me on a tour of the school. There's over 600 students, 150 staff, and my brother knows all of them. This is the challenge, ladies and gentlemen. He'd take me to George the gardener. He'd say, Ross, this is George. When George came to the school 7 years ago, the gardens were a bit shabby, but since George has been here, the gardens are magnificent. And then, and George would go, oh, thank you, sir, thank you, sir. And then we'd go to someone else, and he'd give me a potted history of their contribution to the school, and I'm blown away by this leadership. But then this boy, who was probably in about year 10, walked around the corner, and my brother goes, Hamish, just straight away, split-second recognition. And the boy looked up at my brother goes, happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you. Now, I was blown away by this because that is leadership. So what I'm saying to you, see every situation you're in your life as a test of you, not of anyone else. It's got nothing to do with anyone else. You see it often. You're sitting in a restaurant with a fellow human being called a waiter or a waitress leaning over you to get your plate. Does it really hurt for you to stand there, pick up the plate, turn to that person, look them in the face and say thank you? It's a small gesture, but it says a lot about you. Every situation as a test. When the flowers are arriving at the front door, the robbers are leaving by the back door. What do I mean by that? I mean sometimes wonderful things happen in life, sometimes horrible things happen. Happens to all of us. But it's how you're reacting behind your eyes that are the most important. The fourth element here is connectedness. The connectedness we feel to each other. We're all in this together. There is no, there's you, there's me. We're in this together. We're all contributing. This is my dad, and I always get a bit choked up when I talk about Dad. Dad died well over 15 years ago. Now, I've got to say, ladies and gentlemen, some people have a fear of public speaking. I have a fear of not public speaking. I have a fear of not being asked. But when I found out, and thank you, Anthony. So when I found out Dad was dying and he was going into the terminal phase of his cancer, I dreaded every day to his funeral because I knew I'd stand there in front of everyone and break down about 5 or 6 times because of the feelings I had about Dad. And when I said at the start, climbing the ladder to success to find you're on the wrong wall, my dad was on the right wall. He didn't have a title in front of his name. He didn't have degrees after his name. He didn't drive a flash car or live in a big house. But he taught me 3 magnificent principles. The principles of devotion, loyalty, and unconditional love. And wouldn't it be wonderful if that's all we were all remembered for? He taught me the importance of being loved and supported, what I could do for other people, not what I could suck out of the situation for myself. He taught me that beautiful spiritual connection. I'm not talking religion here, but you do know what would happen if you took all the people who fell asleep at church and laid them end to end, they'd be a lot more comfortable. I'm talking about the fact that we're one big organism. And then finally, the final thing here, and probably the most important, is our capacity. It's our capacity to respond to the unexpected, the uninvited, and the unimaginable. And I think the hardest lessons in life are really our best teachers. And I was privileged, absolutely privileged, that my hardest lesson came when I was very young. This gentleman here was my best friend at high school. 1 week before the final exams, he drowned in a swimming pool. And that was it for me. Plunged myself into my own grief, couldn't study, I was going to fail, that was the end of it. But what I didn't count on was his grandfather. His grandfather, I believe, was one of the greatest ever Australians, and some people in this audience would know him, or would have known of him, as a fellow by the name of Sir Lorimer Dodds. Sir Lorimer started the Children's Medical Research Foundation in Sydney. And I'd met Sir Lorimer. He was one of those beautiful, wise old men. You walk into the room with this man, he just exuded this peace and wisdom. And he had this extraordinary ability to make people feel comfortable. But you'd forgive a grandfather at his grandson's funeral for wanting to plunge himself into his own grief. But Sir Lorimer stood there with the dignity he always displayed, thanking everyone for coming. I walked out and he said, Ross, I need to speak to you. He said, you and Jack were going to do medicine. Now you have to do it for both of you. And can you imagine at the age of 17 being hit between the eyes with that number? So there I was. I had to make a decision to keep feeling sorry for myself, plunging myself into my own grief, or living for 2 people. And I'm still living my life for 2 people. I'm still practicing medicine for 2 people. I'm still speaking in these wonderful forums for 2 people. And it's not a burden, it's a privilege. It's an absolute privilege. And that's how we should see life. Life is a privilege. And what I want you to do is to go into every moment of your life. Forget about what happened yesterday. All you have is right now. Go into every moment and say to yourself, I choose peace over this. I'm not going to give you the power to cause my heart attack. And most importantly, go into every moment with the attitude, how may I serve? Not what can I suck out of this for me? Confucius once said, a journey of 1,000 steps begins with a single step. You should see every part of your life as a micro experience. And in that micro experience, you can either choose to be happy, choose to be healthy, or choose to be unhappy or unhealthy. Happiness, peace and contentment are easily the best drugs on the planet. It's your choice. Thank you.
We've heard from some amazing speakers today, and we're going to hear from even more to come. And I'm just so excited to be standing here. It's part of why I love being a medical student, because you're surrounded with all these amazing people who have a vision. Because at some degree, when we enter a field of medicine or we express an interest in medicine, we are making a statement. We are saying that we want to contribute part of our lives into serving the community, and that we believe that medicine is a really beautiful and tangible way to do it. But the thing is, when people meet me, they say, so, who are you? What do you do? And invariably, most of us go, well, I'm a medical student. And the next thing they ask us is, so, what do you want to do after that? Do you want to specialize, be a cardiothoracic surgeon, or be a researcher? And sometimes, just once in a while, I'm tempted to say, well, I was actually thinking of doing a double major in pediatrics and tap dancing. Now, I don't have any tap dancing skills, but the fact of the matter is that a lot of us who do medicine or are interested in medicine have multiple skills. Medicine is not what defines us. And that's the problem. I think that a lot of medical students feel guilty when they indulge in their other interests, whether it be photography or gaming or traveling, because they feel like they should be studying instead. And what I'd like to suggest is that this sort of guilt is unhealthy. You know, I think that society looks up to doctors as role models, and they should. But air traffic controllers also save lives, but you don't see documentaries and ERs and dramas about them. And why is that? And I think the fact of the matter is that medicine is seen as something that is a great vocation, but it also is seen as something that is life-consuming. And I would suggest that when we look outside of medicine, when we look at the other skills and talents that we're interested in, that can actually help develop us into not being bad doctors because we're splitting up our time, but possibly even making us better doctors. It's almost like that housewife dilemma. You know, can I raise a family and can I work as well? Is it possible to even do both things? And I would argue that as Gen Y, we believe we can. And I mean, we're often thought of as entitled, or that, you know, we don't have the sort of suffering that hardships and wars have brought. But I believe that it gives us an incredible amount of optimism, and it actually enables us to harness the resources and technology around us to make that possible. So I just want to give you a few examples. Gap years is something that is actually a fairly new invention. And 30 years ago, a lot of people would have frowned on the idea of someone taking a year off from medicine. Taking a year off from medicine? How irresponsible. But the thing is that I have friends who have decided to take 1 year off to go play ultimate frisbee for Australia nationally. There's another girl in my university who is dancing for a New York dance company. I have a friend who is studying in China on a scholarship to learn Mandarin. Her boyfriend is terrified that it's going to be impacting on her ability to gain an internship position. But really, when you stop and think about it, medical students these days, by taking chances and taking risks and being able to explore these other avenues outside of medicine, are not only enriching their lives, but they're also becoming better doctors. You know, exploring the world and meeting people from Europe, from Asia, from developing countries, you get an experience of what other lives are like, how to relate to other people. Learning Mandarin, my friend will be able to come back with skills in which she can serve the community. Open education has been an amazing thing that has enabled students who not just wouldn't usually go to university, but who are currently attending university to go and do other things. I know medical students who are studying law degrees, arts degrees, teaching degrees, concurrent to their medical education. And rather than detracting from their abilities as a future doctor, I think it strengthens them. One example where we see technology helping us is through an organization I'm involved with, the Australian Medical Student Journal. We're really passionate about seeing medical students gain the sort of skills and knowledge that they need in order to publish, because when you're a doctor, you're suddenly expected to do all these publications, but you lack the skills, you know? So it'll find me on Skype, or an email, on phone calls with our internal director in Perth, our external director in Adelaide, our editor-in-chief from Tasmania, who, by the way, I've never met. And somehow we are working together across the nation, and in fact, really across the world, to make a difference and to use our skills and talents and bring it back to medicine. There's one particular med student that I want to talk about. His name is Sam Prince. He's an Australian medical student, and he's 27. Actually, he's a doctor now. Whilst he was still studying medicine, Sam had a passion for entrepreneurial change. He decided to open up his own brand of Mexican restaurants. He now has 17 fresh Mexican restaurants called Sombrero around the country. You know, they're making $10 million in revenue. And this was started when he was a medical student? How does this come about? You know, the world is shifting and the world is changing, and we've got to change with it and adapt. And it's not simply that, oh, great, he's a medical student who has made money. He's using the profits from this organization to create two foundations, One Disease at a Time and Imagine. One Disease at a Time is right now working with doctors across Australia to eradicate scabies. You know, when we go away and when we feel liberated to explore other things, we can come back and give medicine even more attention and love that it deserves. And that's really important because mental health and suicide rates are actually higher for doctors than the normal population, and you'd think that we would be the most educated about it. So medical students have a lot to say and they have a lot to give, but we are not just defined by medicine. In fact, when we choose to let medicine define us, as Katie Kavinsky might say, it's like we're looking through a microscope. We miss the whole picture. And really, when we stop letting medicine define us, maybe, just maybe, that's when we'll start to redefine medicine. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And when you were running through the speakers at the beginning, you went through all these interesting people. And then I noticed your voice did drop when you said, and from government, and I assumed that was me. So, yeah, so I'm from the government. I'm here to bore you. No, well, maybe, actually. The academics, those who aren't academics in the audience, might have noticed that some of the academics in the audience, over here somewhere, were moderately respectful to me because I do have about $800 million of the taxpayers' money to hand out each year. I do want to point out, though, that when I'm out of earshot, they bag me like hell, so, you know, it doesn't last very long. So I want to talk about innovation, and when you think about innovation, you think about technology or new drugs or so on, and that's important. But I want to talk about the innovation that we're going to need over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, which is a different sort of innovation. But let's talk about the new substances, new drugs, new technology stuff. And let's learn one lesson from that based on what we know from here in Australia. So we have three big biotech companies in Australia, CSL, the biggest one, Cochlear and ResMed. And why do they get big? Why are their taxes enough to pay for the entire budget of the NHMRC each year? Because they're all built on innovation. When he was in his early 30s, Professor Colin Sullivan at this university that we're on today, University of Sydney, had a patient in his lab who was suffering from sleep apnea. So he'd fall asleep, immediately start to choke and wake him up, and he was pretty desperate. So Colin rigged up a little bit of positive pressure, made up a mask, put it on his face, and solved his problem. And from that, this big company called ResMed has developed, and I hope Colin has made some money out of it as well. In his second half of his 30s, Graham Clark invented the bionic ear. And not only does that bring hearing to people who previously didn't have hearing, so a great good, but also has been the basis of Cochlear, Australia's very innovative biotech company. And Ian Fraser, who I hope you all know, one of the two people who invented the vaccine against cervical cancer. And Ian likes to tell the story that one of the women's magazines here in Australia had a picture of him on their front cover a few years ago with the heading across God's gift to women, because, of course, the vaccine prevents cervical cancer. His wife apparently disagrees with that view, but he was around 30, and his colleague, Jian Zhou, who unfortunately died of hepatitis soon after, was in his 20s. So there are three discoveries that led to the three big companies. Gardasil, of course, developed by CSL and now marketed around the world by Merck. Let's turn to Australia's Nobel Prize winners over the last 20 years. Peter Doherty was in his early 30s when he made the breakthrough discovery in immunology. Liz Blackburn, who she did her undergraduate degree here in Australia, but has been outside Australia ever since. But in the usual Australian way, we still think of her as Australia's Nobel Prize winner. But she does come back a lot. She was in her early 30s when she discovered at the end of the chromosome was a really important part of the integrity of cells, and she's gone on, in fact, to show that some of the social stresses in life shorten those ends of the chromosome, the telomeres, and are a major source of ill health. And then Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, who I'm sure the med students know about, and if you don't, we'll have words with your lecturers. They, of course, discovered that most gastritis and some ulcers were not caused by stress, which I was taught, but are caused mostly by an infection, by a bug, by Helicobacter pylori. And Barry Marshall was in his early 30s when he did the famous self-experiment where he drank some of this bacterium in a cup, and he thought maybe a few years later he might get gastritis, but 3 days later he got gastritis and then cured himself with antibiotics. So for all those who are planning to apply for NHMRC grants in the future, I've got bad news for some of you, because as you see, all those people were in their 30s when they did this breakthrough research. So from today, Ian Hickey, NHMRC grants are only available to people under 40. No, not really, but very tempting. We at the NHMRC want to encourage innovation, and so we provide an award each year for the application to us that is the most innovative and is a fundable piece of research. We actually name one of our grants each year after Barry and Robin to remind people that sometimes the greatest ideas come from left field. But the other thing about Marshall and Warren and the Helicobacter story is the following. This has saved people a lot of suffering, because now you can be treated with an antibiotic rather than have to be on something that reduce your acid secretion into your gut, which you had to stay on practically all your life. But it's also much cheaper for the health system. So this piece of innovative research has actually saved you and me, well, if you're students, you're probably not paying tax, but those of us who are paying tax has saved us some money. So that's the second part of my talk. We really need innovation about the system, not just about individual products and processes that affect individual patients. We have a 19th century model of healthcare, not just here in this country, but around the world. We have disconnected services. We have widely distributed, fractured decision-making about what we pay for or the type of services that we want to offer. We have a workforce, some of you, who are overwhelmed with information and about to be hit by the genomic revolution, which will change how patients come to you in the first place and what you'll need to know to offer some of our sickest patients and the best therapy, but also to individualise preventative processes. We have a system that's resistant to change. There are vested interests everywhere. When you graduate as medical students, you'll be vested interests because you'll be more, no, you won't be more interested. Some of you will be very interested, and you'll all be a little bit interested in your own career and your own income, and that's perfectly understandable, but sometimes that cuts across rational decision-making. Whether system's too costly, you hear about this all the time, but the cost is growing. And the quality of care is not related to how much we pay in the system. If it was, America would have the best health system in the world, but it really, really doesn't, because there's a disconnect between what we know and what we do in the system. So it's costly, and the cost is growing, and we're going to have to do something about it. What can we do about it? Well, we need to know what to do about it. To do that, of course, that's research. We need research of the type that tells us how better to design the system, how better to deliver services. Those poor patients with chronic disease that have a very disconnected, non-continuous set of doctors, nurses and healthcare delivery personnel that really is not delivering them what they need to do. And perhaps more than anything, we need evidence about what works in prevention. Prevention and decisions around prevention is probably the least evidence-based part of the health system because everybody's a bloody expert. Everybody thinks they know what to do to prevent ill health. And if it was working, then we wouldn't have the obesity epidemic we have, and we wouldn't have some of the mental health challenges that we already have. So, how are we going to get change? It's going to cost too much. We need change. Well, there's only one way, and that's research. And I'm the CEO of the NHMRC, so I would say that, wouldn't I? But it's true. And the only way we can harden up policymakers, people who make decisions about what to spend money on, is to provide them with a solid evidence upon which they can make decision. The system, all human beings, but the system is resistant to change. We have to provide the evidence about the change that's needed, sounds like Obama, to make sure that this system is sustainable in the future, and more than that, that we give patients care that's based on evidence and not just based on tradition. So 10 years from now, certainly 40 years from now, when some of you will be still working, this system will be different. The way we think about health will not be a 19th century model. It's going to have to be a 21st century model. To know how to do that relies on research, but you have to be ready for change. Thank you.